Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We'll continue from where we left off last week. My name is Itawa Pula. I am a member here at St. James, and I am excited to continue with this series on African women theologians. Just to take you through what we learned last week and what we learned this week. We started with the introduction and asked ourselves why a theology for African women by African women. Today we'll look at the theology and the theologians, and then next week we'll put it all together through a group sort of assignments. Today, what we'll learn, we'll look at the Apostles' Creed in Swahili. Last week we did the Lord's Prayer in Swahili. So today we'll do the Apostles' Creed. We'll do a recap of what we learned last week and then deep dive into African theologies. We weren't able to do that last week. And then from the African theologies, we'll spend a lot more time looking at the African women theologians, starting from the lady who started the movement and the organization or the entity that birthed the theology. Again, like last week, I just want to mention a couple of things that are out of scope. Spread of Christianity and Islam in Africa, as well as various social constructs. Again, I repeat, 3,000 tribes across the continent of Africa. We can't just have one way of living, of looking at different social things, and gender is one of those. So we'll start with prayer. I'll say the Apostles' Creed in Swahili. The words are both in Swahili and English, so you can follow along. I want to point out Imani is faith. Mitume is apostles, so the faith of the apostles, the creed of the apostles. So we start. Namwamini Mungu Baba Mwenyezi, muumba mbingu na nchi, na Yesu Kristo, mwana wake wa pekee, Bwana wetu. Alitwaa mwili kwa tendo la Roho Mtakatifu, akazaliwa na Bikira Maria, akateswa zamani za Pontio Pilato, akasulubiwa, akafa, akazikwa, akashukia kuzimu kwa wafu, akafufuka katika wafu siku ya tatu, akapaa mbinguni, ameketi mkono wa kuume wa Bwana Mungu Baba Mwenyezi. Kutoka huko atakuja kuhukumu wazima na wafu. Na mwamini Roho Mtakatifu, kanisa takatifu ya waamini wote, ushirika wa watakatifu, ondoleo la dhambi, ufufuko wa mwili na uzima wa milele. Amina. Good. So I'll start with a recap just for everyone who is new today to know where we are at, and for everyone who was here last week to get a refresher of the things we talked about. So last week we did a lot of groundwork, looked at the background and setting and the times we're looking at, and the geographical region is Africa. I just want to point out that someone mentioned Israel, Jordan, and Jerusalem when we're doing the group work of naming countries. And I have this map here to show that Africa ends with where the yellow, which is Egypt, ends. Everything else is the Middle East and Asia. And so Israel, Jordan, Jerusalem are in the Middle East. They're not in Africa. And then historically, we talked about pre-colonial times, colonial times, and post-colonial times. And pre-colonial times, we talked mostly about the African religions at that time. Colonial times, we looked at the map of Africa before and during colonization. And then post-colonial, we looked at the map of Africa with different countries when they've gotten independence. And we also looked at religions. We did a quote from John Beatty where he talks about the Via Party and the exam room and the parliament. And those are just ways to show that Africans carry religion with them. Religion is part of their everyday life. And then we also looked at different aspects of African religion and spirituality. Is also a word that is used interchangeably with religions, depending with the person who's talking. Same way I talked about it last week with traditional and indigenous religions. We looked at Gai and the Gikuyu tribe and the 9 daughters, and also saw how that is somewhat the same with the Hebrew creation story, which is also the same across different African tribes. We looked at the role of nature in worship and religion, also the communal aspect and the everyday aspect of it. So that was last week. This week we'll start with theology. Last week we looked at African religions. This week we're looking at African theologies in capital. And I just want to point out that we're looking at this in relation to Christianity. You can look at it in relation to Islam and many other religions across Africa, but for our context, we'll look at it in relation to Christianity. So there are many theologies that go with the many religions, and I'll be looking at 4 main theologies. And I just want to point out, just as the religions are all about experience and reality, the being, the doing, the active, the now, as opposed to written down ways of living, written down ways of studying the Bible, written down ways of thinking about God and community. That's just the same way, that's not the way African theologies are. And 4 main ones to look at, we'll start with the Black liberation theology. And I want to show a book. I showed this last week. It's a prayer book by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, but he's written many, many other books. And he's considered as among the people who led the Black liberation theology in Africa. There's another version of that theology here in the US, and it was in the civil rights movement in the 60s. And in that theology, Jesus is seen as the liberator. And so people are looking at their lives and they're looking at it from a point of exodus, of leaving the oppression they're going through at that time. Then the second type of theology, we touched on this a little bit last week when we did the quote by John Beatty, and it's the African theology, and it's just putting into context Christianity and African culture. And this is at a time where Africans are fighting for independence, and some of them have just gotten independence. And so I have the group there, Africans 70s, and so that's Africans during the 1970s. And why do we need to have a theology that looks at African culture? So an example of a Bible verse would be the one I have there, whiter than snow. So in Isaiah and Psalms, there are Bible verses that talk about getting washed and being whiter than snow. So in Africa, a lot of the countries do not get snow. So that Bible verse is not something Africans can fully grasp because they are not aware of what that experience feels like. And so it's hard for them to understand how that experience would feel like once they have God or their sins are forgiven. And so putting it in African context would be using an example of cotton wool. A lot of Africans at that time were beginning to own cotton farms. And so that's something, the whiteness, the fluffiness, the purity of cotton is something that they could relate to. And so an African theology looks at the Hebrew and Greek writings and says, so if these things were translated into the African context, what would that look like? And what would that look like without losing the original meaning that the people who wrote the Bible had in mind. So notable leaders, we talked about John Beatty, and for him, this theology was written, so with the academics, but it was also oral with the storytelling, narratives, and also with symbols. Third, we're looking at the African women theology, and we'll spend a lot of time on this today, so I'll just mention it in passing. The time is post-colonial, so African countries have gotten independence. It's more like the African theology, but then it's looking at things from a women's lens, and is around the 80s and 90s, and the leader is Mercy and the Circle of Concerned African Theologians. We'll talk a little bit more about that during our session today. But it was important for African women to put themselves into that conversation and interpretation of the Bible, because there are things within African culture and the Bible that sort of look like they favor men and do a disservice to women. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about that today. Last but not least is the African theology of Reconstruction. So this is post-colonial, and at that time, Bishop Desmond Tutu was the head of the All-African Council of Churches, which is an ecumenical movement similar to the World Council of Churches. And he asked a Kenyan called Jesse Mugambi to do research and examine Christianity in the African context now that Africans have gotten independence. And Jesse Mugambi said that Africans now are moving from an exodus mindset, which is what I mentioned at the very beginning here. Exodus mindset, meaning that they're going through colonization and they are looking for ways to live. And now they're moving to a reconstruction where now they have their own governments, their own administrations, and they're thinking of ways of doing that and asking themselves, do we just do it the pre-colonial way, the colonial way, or come up with our own way? And so how do we have a religion that is continental first, as opposed to what was taught to us in the first place? So those are the main theologies. They're not the only theologies, but those are the main theologies. Also want to point out, as the women were discussing how the African theology can be inclusive and look at things from the experience of women. This was in 1989, and the second one was in 1990. So they were happening around the same time. Today we're just going to deal with the African women's theology. Good, so we're moving to the African women's theology. This is the lady who sort of is considered the mother of African women's theology. She's from Ghana. Her father was a Methodist priest who went to the UK for school, and that's sort of part of the many things that helped her shape her reasoning and her perspective about Christianity, the continent of Africa. She studied theology both in Ghana and the UK, and she was the first African woman to get a PhD in theology. She worked as both as a teacher and in the ecumenical movement, so in the All-African Council of Churches, as well as the World Council of Churches, where she was the Deputy Secretary General. And then there's an ecumenical movement for third world theologians, and this is what the world calls the global south, or the majority world. And so in the development world, they call America, North America, Europe, what other continents there? Asia. No, part of Asia is in the third world. So anyway, in the developmental movement, if you look at the way the map is, there are countries that are called the global north, or first world countries, and then there's a global south, third world countries, majority world, depending on what space you're in. And so there's an ecumenical movement for those countries. So the gaps that she saw when she was doing her work was one, the Lone Ranger of being the first. And so as I mentioned, she was the first female African to get a PhD in theology. And so finding herself in a lot of spaces where she was the only one, or the only one or the first one to be in that space, and asking herself, so where are the people? Where are the other people? Are there other people who are doing this work, or am I the only one? And that was both, and also seeing this being reflected in Africa, where in a lot of theological leadership and church spaces, there weren't that many women. And so women were mostly at home, and the men were sort of trying to figure out this whole building the nation thing. And so her asking herself, is that really true, or are there really women out there who are doing this work? It's just that they're not being talked about as often as the men are being talked about. So that's one of the things that got her thinking. And then another thing is, when she found women who are doing theology work across the globe, she saw there are very few African women. And she saw this during a meeting that happened in Harvard, and she'd been invited. And the language that was used and the examples that were used were not in line with how African women live. It's not that they were wrong, it's just they did not capture all the women as much as it said it was a global women's meeting, it didn't capture African women. And so she kept telling them that culture is very important to Africans. And so when African women speak and they speak about theology, culture is very important. And so that's where the idea of coming up with a group of people who will speak in these spaces and speak and shape what theology for and about Africans, and puts into context what it is for African women was born. And so that's why I've gone into depth about her journey, because it's informed how we got the African women's theology. So the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. So at that time, she was working in Geneva. She was the Deputy Secretary General of the World Council of Churches. And so she called a couple of women who were working in theology. So as she asked herself those questions, she was able to do her research and found a couple of women who are doing this work. It's just that their work was either not being published or they were not being seen in conferences and things like that. And so she called them to Geneva, and they call themselves birth attendants. I love that phrase, because then they helped in the birthing of this theology. And so they're like the midwives of this theology. And so that collective was the Circle. A lot of women, when they meet, they sit in a circle, and most of the time they'll sit on the floor in a circle. And so circle is enclosed. It means we are guiding and protecting each other. And another beauty of the circle is that it can be expanded. And so that's part of why they call themselves a circle. Concerned is because they are concerned about specific issues that are affecting African women, and they're all theologians. And for them, theologians is not just the academic type, it's anyone who's interested in doing the work of learning about God from the context that they're in. And so they had their meeting, and they also that they were academics living in the third world countries, but they had been taught first world theology. So they themselves, within themselves, had that tension. And so this meeting was a way for them to, you too. Oh my God, let's do this thing. So that's how they came together, and then they wrote letters to colleges and churches in Africa asking women to be part of the movement. And 70 of them were able to go to Ghana in 1989. And I mentioned Mercy, gave the keynote address, and she said, we need to have a two-winged theology, meaning that a bird cannot fly with one wing. It needs the other wing. And so the theology that Africans had been using that time was one wing because it did not include women and the issues that they were facing. And so she encouraged that they have a two-winged theology. And so the photos are not the best, but this is that first meeting in 1989. And so it doesn't have all 70. I think we have maybe like 40 or 50 in this one. I like this photo because I think the slides will be uploaded. You'll see. First, babies were welcome, so I love that. And two, on this 2 sheets of paper, you get to see some of the things and the ideas that they were thinking about. And I'll share some of them with you. But it just made me happy just to see this photo and see the women. So key themes and perspectives. So first of all, inclusion. And just even from what I mentioned with the two wings, it was we need to have everybody on board. And so the membership is Pan-African, meaning everybody across the African continent is welcome to be a member. It's ecumenical, meaning that it's interdenominational. So anyone from any denomination is welcome. And then later it became interreligious, meaning that even Muslim women could be part of the movement. So theology then was not just Christian theology, but it was how we relate to God. And so anyone from Muslim and even what we call the traditional or indigenous religions was welcome to be part of it. I want to share a little bit about how interreligious coexistence happens in Africa. So in 2002-3, I don't have the year right, but it's the beginning of the early 2000s. Liberia, which is a country on the western side of Africa, was going through civil war. And this was, I think, the second civil war. There had been a coup. They wanted the president out, and it was just chaotic. So the Christian women started praying. And then after a couple of prayer meetings, the Muslim women joined them. And then they said, we need to do more than just prayer. We need to put action to our faith. And so they started protesting. And they said, okay, yes, we can protest, but we need to have a tangible plan. And they said, okay, we need to get these people in the same room, have them discuss what they need, come up with a solution, and then hopefully have a peaceful country. And so not just them, but of course, there are many other bodies, both in Africa and international, that were also trying to see peace restored in Liberia. And so the two groups that were at war were able to say, okay, cool, we'll have a meeting, we'll have it in Ghana, which is another West African country, and we'll see what happens. And so the two groups went to Ghana for the meeting, and the women flew, a couple of women, to go to the meeting. And then when the meeting, I don't know if it's before it started or when it was going on, they said, okay, you can stay in that room, talk all you want, but when you leave this room, you should have, like they put their whole motherhood there. You should have gotten a solution for this thing. If you don't, we're going to strip naked. In African culture, it is taboo to see your mother naked. And your mother is not just a woman who gave birth to you, it's any elderly woman. And so nobody wants that curse on them. So I'm not saying that it's 100% because of the women that they came up with a resolution, but it's played a really big role. And they didn't stop there. They decided to have one of them run for office. And this is the lady who ran for office and became the first elected African woman president. Her name is Salif Johnson. The Christian woman, the Muslim woman, and herself won a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm sorry, I'm calling them the Christian woman, the Muslim woman. I should have their names, but I just wanted to show the interreligious coexistence and how when women come together and also when different faiths come together. And so for us, it's not just about the faith, it's about the whole person and how community can work together and exist together. And so it's the person before the faith. And part of the culture and the religion is working and being together. And so that's just an example of inclusion and coexistence. And this book, This Child Will Be Great, is an amazing book because she writes it from her experience growing up in Liberia, first Civil War, that second Civil War, and how the women mobilized, and just her campaign journey and all the things that happened along the way. Another example I want to share about coexistence is if you go to any African country, and mostly the major cities, you're most likely on any day of the week to hear church bells, and that's on a Sunday. On Friday, you'll hear the, I don't know what they call it, but when the mosque does the morning call. And on Friday, you'll see all the Muslims in their kanzus and the ladies in their buibus. And then on random days, because the indigenous churches just, when the Holy Spirit touches, okay, that's how we joke. So on random days, you'll see them with their drums and their shouting and praising on the road. And nobody's asking anyone because you do your thing. How you pray and communicate with God is how you pray and communicate with God. Even on national and religious holidays, all those days are off days. Like the way Christmas is an off day for some people, for us, Christmas is an off day for everyone. Eid Mubarak is an off day for everyone. So all those days are sort of intermingled together, and just the same way we'll see adverts on TV with jingle bells and all those things. During Ramadan, you'll see adverts with their prayer calendar and all those things. So it's just part of everyday life and inclusion, community. Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Because I know that historically you had spoken about some of the patriarchal domination. As this progressed, was there any pushback from the men?
Yes and no. So yes to that, especially through her book, you'll be able to see some of the things they went through, even before she started campaigning. But then there's also that notion of, it's just a woman's thing, that just, these mothers are always complaining and talking. And so to a certain extent, there are people who didn't really see how far they'll go, but then with the will strip naked, that one everybody took serious. I shouldn't say it like that, but with the taboo thing, erase and rewind, with the taboo part, everybody took it serious. Again, shows the power of culture and maintaining and that whole ancestral and all those things coming together. Yeah. So it was yes and no. Again, I've really watered it down, so don't go around and say, oh, women in Africa just threaten to strip and everything happens. I really watered it down, but just wanted to show the connection between how Muslims and Christians and different other faiths work together. Okay. Yeah, so okay, it's communal. I think I've really talked about communal. I've talked about single mothers and kinsman redeemers, and just that whole notion of how can the community care for single mothers or widows without them having to be quote unquote inherited. So those are some of the things that they wanted to look at. This theologian here happens to be my grandmother. So you can see we have the same teeth. That's what she did. So I call her a theologian. She's not a theologian in any person's books, but she used a lot of what was later known as cultural hermeneutics and storytelling, oral theologies, because she told stories by the fireplace. She built a church in her village, so she's a superwoman and lineage. So that's a theme. So she's not a theme, but that's a theme. The cultural and the oral theologies is also really strong within African culture and also within the African women's theology, because a lot of women would be in the kitchen doing a lot of housework. And so they use that as an avenue to teach about theology. And so she would be telling you, pass me the salt, and as she tells you a story or sings a song or does. So it was part of their everyday life. So it wasn't like, okay, let me teach you about God. God is da 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 da. Let me teach you about church. Church is da 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 da. But then she'll say, wake up, let's go to church. And as you go to church, she'll tell you this thing and that thing and that thing. So it's almost like apprenticeship where you're learning as you go, as opposed to sitting and doing like a formal education type thing. And this was important for African women theologians to have as a way of how they do their things, because women would be busy doing a lot of things and they wouldn't be in spaces or barazas or out there talking, quote unquote, men things. And so they would incorporate it in their everyday life. And then view of Christ. Christ is a Messiah who saves and brings good news. I think someone last week asked about Messiah. And with saving and bringing good news is different for different people. So good, what is good news to me is not necessarily good news to you. What is saving to me is not necessarily saving to you. And so for African women, that looks very different from as compared to African men, and looks very different when you compare with people from other parts of the world. And church is a community, is a place of coming together of all those people and being able to continue with the communal work. So the circle, after they had the meeting in Geneva, decided that and in Ghana, decided that they'll be meeting every 5 years and going to different parts of the country. And during those meetings, people would present papers on different topics, because as you remember, Mercy had seen they didn't have that many African women in different spaces speaking about different things. And so, paper presentation was part of the things that people are required to do to attend. And then during those meetings, they would elect a convener who would convene the circle for the next 5 years. And they later had regional and language-based circles. So you remember we talked about Francophone, Anglophone, those types of divisions. And so they were able to have circles based on that, and also circles based on Northeast, Southwest Africa. And then they also have chapters here in the US and in Europe. I am looking at the time and I want to see. Okay, so this is a quote by Mercy talking about culture and how culture can be liberating at times, and at times it's not liberating. And these are the books that she has written or have been written about her. This is a key book if you're looking to learn about African women's theology. It talks about the themes, perspectives, and all those things. This and that book are books that have been written in honor of her and the work that she's done. There are many other publications, but these are the main ones. Then this was the first convener. So when they had the second meeting and they were able to elect someone, they got this lady. She's from Kenya. And what I want to point out is her quote. So she says, one woman can bring change to a family. Many women gather together will bring change to humanity. And I just I put that there with reference to the Liberian women and what they were able to do to help in restoring peace in their country. I'm going quickly because it's time. The key book is the cultural hermeneutics one. And so Matthew was able to sort of plant the seeds. Musembi helped to sort of start thinking about it from a theological angle. What are some of the things that would be needed? And that's the book that she came up with. And for that meeting, when people presented papers, this is the book that all the papers that were presented in that meeting went into. Then this is the third one, and this is from Malawi, yeah. So this is Dr. Firi from Malawi, and she talks about storytelling. And so, as I mentioned, how my grandmother does it. So this is about storytelling and the power that stories have. I wanted to point out, threads of incitement. So she moved, so Mercy planted the seeds. Musembi sort of started thinking about it from a theological point of view. She started thinking about it from topics. And so one of the topics that she started looking at is the various types of injustices that women go through and asking women to start thinking about things. So teaching and training people how to ask questions differently. And she got threats, her house was stoned, she had to run away to Namibia, our neighboring country. And so when we think about people who are sort of persecuted for how they interpret the faith, this is an example of that within the African context. And then for the meeting they had, these are the books that I think the last one, and at that time, HIV/AIDS was the big thing in Africa and across the world. And so when you think about widow inheritance and things like that, if a man has all these women and one of them unfortunately has AIDS, it goes around and also the children are affected. And so at that time, HIV/AIDS was one of the big topics that was discussed. And her thinking, even with moving from just hermeneutics to topics, was, yes, we can have this structure of the how, but then how do we apply it? And that's why she decided to go to topics. I won't talk about her. This is the current one, but they had a meeting last week, so maybe she is no longer the coordinator, but she talks about what the circle is and the work that it does. She's from Botswana. And the meeting that they had was now on climate change and looking at Mother Earth and Mother Africa. And so the topics also changed with what is happening at the time. So we'll look at gains and critics and things like that next week, as we also now have our group discussion and see how can that be applied. There are many more women, but I just wanted to touch on the key things. And we are good on time. Oh, sorry, one more thing. This is a book on soul care for African Americans, and so liberation theology. This has really good information on that.
Yes, yeah. That's USA women.
Yes, yes. So, and it starts from when people were gotten from Africa and the types of ways they took care of themselves spiritually as they came to the US and navigated their way in the US.
What's it called and who wrote it?
It's by Barbara Peacock. It's called Soul Care in African American Practice.
Thank you.